Hello, and welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. This is Module 4.1, Section A. In this video, we're going to be discussing savers, borrowers, financial markets, and the market for loanable funds. This is the first time we're going to introduce the concept of interest rates. And interest rates are really important in our economy, and we're going to start to explore them in much greater detail. So when we're talking about financial markets, we have two types of economic agents that interact in this market. The first are savers. And savers, we're going to assume, are households that have excess funds and want to put those excess funds into interest-bearing assets. In other words, these are households that have already used all of their income that they need to buy the goods and services that they want, and they have a little bit left over. Instead of sitting on that money and doing nothing with it, they can put it into interest-bearing assets or some form of savings and gain interest income on that. On the other hand, we have our borrowers, and borrowers are going to be firms or sometimes households that want to make investments. And remember, in economics, when we say investments, these are going to be investments into physical capital if you're a firm. And if you're a household, it's going to be an investment probably in a home. So these firms and households, let's assume that they're just firms for simplicity's sake, are going to be going and looking for some type of funding, some type of loans to help them make the purchases that they need as investments for their business. In the market for loanable funds, we're going to be bringing together our borrowers and savers. Savers have the excess funds looking for some type of return on those funds, and borrowers need funds to be able to purchase the physical capital to expand their businesses. The market for loanable funds is going to be similar to the supply and demand models that we've seen thus far, but it is going to be helping us to determine the interest rate in our economy and the quantity of loanable funds and the level of investment spending that we observe in the economy. A few simplifying assumptions: we're going to assume that all of our savers and borrowers interact in one financial market. We're also going to assume that there's one interest rate, and that's going to be the return on the savings as well as the cost of borrowing. So to start off with, let's talk about the supply. The supply of loanable funds is going to be coming from our savers. We can also call this the savings curve. As you can see, the supply curve is going to be an upward sloping line, meaning that as interest rates rise, people are going to be more willing to supply loanable funds. Because they're going to be getting higher returns, they're going to be more willing to put their excess funds into this market. At lower interest rates, they'd rather hold on to that money or hold on to their wealth rather than putting it into a less liquid interest-bearing form. On the other hand, our demand curve is going to be downward sloping. Remember, demand for loanable funds is going to come from the borrowers. So borrowers are coming into this market looking for loans, and they're going to be demanding loans specifically for the purposes of making investment purchases. So this demand curve, the demand for loanable funds, can also be called our investment curve. As you can see, when the interest rate is high, the demand for loanable funds is going to be low. What does this mean? Well, the loans are going to be expensive, so there's going to be less firms, less borrowers willing to take out loans at high interest rates. At low interest rates, it is enticing to take on loans, expand your business, build and buy new capital. So more firms are going to be willing to make those investment purchases and investment spending, and therefore the demand for loanable funds will be higher. When we bring these two curves together, the supply curve or savings curve with our demand curve or investment curve, we see that we can determine the equilibrium interest rate in our economy, as well as the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. What we'll see is that the interest rate is going to adjust to ensure that supply and demand equal each other, or savings and investment meet. So let's talk about some factors that may cause changes in the loanable funds. Really, what we're thinking about when we see shifts in the supply curve or shifts in the demand curve, we have to link it back to changes in either suppliers, savers willing to provide funds into this market, or borrowers willing to make investment spending or investment purchases. So let's start off with one example. specifically targeting savers. So let's assume that we have a situation where the government decides to decrease taxes on interest income. So whenever you're gaining interest income, you have to pay part of it as a tax. So what happens if the government decides to decrease how much taxes you pay on the money that you gain from your interest-bearing assets? So first, which curve is going to be affected and why? Well, this is going to affect savers because savers are the ones that are gaining interest income. So our supply curve is going to change. And in which direction will it change? Well, it's going to shift out or to the right. At each interest rate, at each price point, suppliers are going to be willing to supply more excess funds into the loanable funds market. They're going to be putting more of their excess funds into interest-bearing assets. As a result, this is going to lead to a new equilibrium, point B, and we observe that this is going to mean that interest rates fall and the quantity of loanable funds rises. As we move along the demand curve to our new equilibrium point, this is telling us that investment spending is rising. Loans are becoming cheaper, quantity demanded is changing, we have a shift in the supply curve and a movement along the demand curve. The result in this new equilibrium is a lower interest rate and more loanable funds available. Now, what about a situation where instead the government is looking for a way to enhance the progress in green technology? So it is offering a tax credit for any firm that invests in new green technology. So what's going to happen? Well, a few hints there. It's going to be impacting the demand curve because it's going to impact demand because it's a way for the government to enhance investment spending by firms, specifically into green technology. This tax credit is going to cause a shift out or to the right of the demand curve as more firms take advantage of this tax credit and go out, seek new loans to be able to get investments in green technology. So the result is, with our equilibrium, we now move along the supply curve to our new equilibrium at point B. Interest rates start to rise, and the quantity of loanable funds also rises. So we see an increase in interest rates and an increase in investment spending as a result of this tax credit. There's one more scenario that we need to discuss with the loanable funds market, and this is what happens when the government runs a budget deficit. So we have a situation where the government, we know, spends money on goods and services. Now, the government gets money to spend on goods and services from its tax revenue. But sometimes we have situations where the government runs a deficit, meaning that the tax revenue it gets is not enough to pay for the goods and services that it purchases. One of the ways that they finance or fund this deficit is through the issuance of new bonds. Now, in the loanable funds market, we're only talking about, remember, households as savers and firms as borrowers. The government is not directly part of this loanable funds market that we have discussed thus far. But when it issues new bonds, it provides a greater variety of interest-bearing assets for savers to use. So savers still have the same number of excess funds, but now they have more places of where to put those excess funds. They can either put it in the loanable funds market or they can put it in the government bond market. So what will be the results of a government budget deficit on the loanable funds market? Well, as the government issues new loans, this is going to take some of the money or some of the assets that were in the loanable funds market. So what's going to happen if the government issues new bonds? Well, in the loanable funds market, some of the excess funds that were previously in the loanable funds is now going to move to the government bond market. As a result, as savers move some of their excess funds into government bonds, this is going to decrease the supply of loanable funds in this market. So what happens if governments issue new bonds to finance their budget deficits? Well, what they're going to do is essentially crowd out some of the investment that was previously available to firms. How does this happen? Savers have the same number of excess funds, but now some of it stays in the loanable funds market as savings, and some of it now moves to the government bond market. As this happens, the supply of loanable funds decreases. So we see a shift in or to the left of our supply curve. The result, therefore, is that we have an increase in the interest rate and a decrease in the quantity of loanable funds that are available. As the interest rate rises, we see a movement along the demand curve, indicating that we have a decrease in investment spending because there are less loanable funds available to businesses. So again, this is the idea of the crowding out effect. If the government is financing its spending through issuing new bonds, it's taking some of the assets, some of the interest-bearing assets, some of the excess savings that households have that were previously available for firms and now using them in government bonds. So what have we learned in this segment so far? So we've learned about the loanable funds market, one of the ways that we determine interest rates in our economy, and we've seen that the interaction between savers and borrowers is critical in explaining both the level of interest rates that we have as well as the level of investment spending that we have in our economy. This model is going to be very important in helping us understand financial markets and how savers and borrowers interact. Thank you so much for joining me in Module 4.1a.